She had 30 seconds to make a choice that would either destroy her life or save it. A minimum wage waitress. A billionaire's catastrophic mistake. One sentence that could cost her everything. What would you do if speaking up meant losing the only job keeping your dying sister alive? What would you do if staying silent meant watching someone throw away millions because of a simple math error you could fix? Sarah Mitchell had 30 seconds to decide. And what happened next didn't just change her life. It exposed a betrayal 20 years in the making, took down an empire, and proved that the most dangerous person in any room is the one everyone thinks is invisible. This is the true story of how one moment of courage shattered everything. Stay until the end, because the twist will leave you speechless. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. You know that feeling when life has you pinned down so hard you can barely breathe? When every day feels like you're drowning just a little bit more. That's where Sarah Mitchell found herself on a rainy Wednesday morning in downtown Chicago. 27 years old, and she was already exhausted. Not just tired, exhausted deep in her bones, in her soul. She'd been working double shifts at Riley's Diner for 3 years straight. Her feet ached constantly. Her back hurt. And the smell of burnt bacon and cheap coffee had permanently soaked into her skin, her clothes, everything she owned. But the physical pain? That was nothing compared to what waited for her at home. Every evening, Sarah would drag herself back to their tiny apartment where her younger sister, Amy, was fighting cancer. Just 19 years old, and battling a disease that was eating up their lives in every possible way. The medical bills were crushing them. Sarah had a drawer full of red envelopes, final notices, collection letters, threats to send their debt to court. She'd had dreams once. Big ones. Sarah had been studying architecture at the community college. She loved designing buildings, imagining how spaces could make people feel safe, inspired, alive. She was so close to finishing her degree, just 1 year left. But when Amy got sick and their parents had passed away years before, Sarah had to make a choice. School or survival. Dreams or reality. She chose her sister. She always would. So every morning, Sarah would tie on that stained apron, paste on a fake smile, and serve coffee to people who barely saw her. To them, she was invisible. Just the waitress. Just someone to bark orders at, someone to leave a $1 tip for if they were feeling generous. This particular Wednesday started like any other. The morning rush was brutal. Business people shouting orders, teenagers making a mess, regulars complaining about everything. Sarah moved through it all like a ghost, refilling cups, clearing plates, apologizing for things that weren't her fault. And then he walked in. The man was different from their usual customers. Everything about him screamed money, from his perfectly tailored navy suit to the way he carried himself like he owned the world. Behind him walked a younger man, also in an expensive suit, but trying way too hard to look important. They sat in booth 7, the one by the window with the cracked seat that Sarah kept meaning to ask her boss to fix. The older man barely looked up when Sarah approached. "Coffee." "Black," he said, his voice rough and impatient. His attention was already on a stack of papers he'd spread across the table. "And for you, sir?" Sarah asked the younger man. He looked at her uniform with disgust, like she was something dirty he'd stepped in. "Same. And hurry up." Sarah brought their coffee, her hands steady despite the bone-deep tiredness. As she set down the cups, her eyes accidentally caught something on the papers spread across the table. Numbers. Lots of numbers. Calculations. Building specifications, architectural plans, construction cost estimates. The older man was working through a formula, calculating the total investment needed for what looked like a massive real estate development project. Multiple buildings. Hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. And his math was completely wrong. Sarah froze. The diner sounds faded away, the clatter of dishes, the hiss of the grill, the chatter of customers. All she could see were those numbers. He was calculating the structural load-bearing requirements, but he'd mixed up the formula. Instead of dividing the weight distribution by the number of support columns, he was multiplying it. The error would make him think he needed twice as much reinforcement as actually necessary. He'd overbilled by millions, no, tens of millions of dollars. The project would become so expensive it wouldn't make financial sense, and he'd probably abandon the whole thing. Sarah knew this because in her previous life, her before life, she'd been brilliant at architectural mathematics. She could see structural equations in her sleep. She'd won awards in college for her calculations. All that knowledge was still there, locked inside her, unused, wasted. The older man was now talking to his companion. The numbers don't work, Derek. The construction costs are too high. We'd need to double our investment just to meet safety standards. I'm killing the project. Derek nodded eagerly. Absolutely, Mr. Harrison. Very wise decision. These downtown developments are too risky anyway. Sarah's heart was pounding. This man was about to walk away from what could be an incredible project because of a simple math error. And something about the way Derek was agreeing so quickly, so enthusiastically, felt wrong. His body language was off. He looked pleased. Relieved. She thought about the red envelopes at home. She thought about Amy's medicine they couldn't afford. She thought about how she'd been invisible for 3 years, how she'd swallowed her pride and her intelligence day after day after day. What did she have left to lose? Her dignity had been paid out in quarters and dimes a long time ago. Her dreams were already dead. And if she stayed silent, if she stayed invisible, nothing would ever change. Sarah took a breath that felt like jumping off a cliff. Excuse me, sir. Derek's head snapped up. We're in a private meeting. Go away. But something in Sarah's voice made the older man, Mr. Harrison, look up. His eyes were sharp, cold, calculating. What? I'm sorry to interrupt, Sarah said, her voice shaking but clear. But your math is wrong. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Have you ever had a moment where you can feel your entire life balancing on a knife's edge? Where one sentence, one choice, could either destroy you or save you. That's where Sarah stood, with every eye in the diner suddenly locked on her. Derek looked like he was about to explode. His face turned red. Are you serious right now? How dare you, Mr. Harrison? I'll have her fired immediately. But Victor Harrison, owner of Harrison Property Empire and one of the most powerful real estate developers in the Midwest, wasn't yelling. He was just staring at Sarah with those ice-cold eyes. The silence stretched so long Sarah thought she might pass out. What did you just say to me? His voice was quiet. Dangerous. Sarah's knees felt weak, but she'd already jumped. No going back now. Your calculations, sir. The structural load formula. You're multiplying the weight distribution by the support column ratio when you should be dividing. The formula you're using would tell you the building needs twice as much reinforcement as it actually does. You're making the project seem impossible when it's actually completely viable. She pointed at the paper with a trembling finger. Right here. You've written total load times support density. But it should be total load divided by support density. With the correct calculation, your construction costs drop by almost 40%. The project becomes not just possible, but profitable. Derek was making sputtering sounds. This is insane. Mr. Harrison, she's a waitress. She doesn't know what she's talking about. I've run these numbers 3 times. Have you? Sarah heard herself say. And suddenly, something clicked in her mind. Something about Derek's expression. About the way he'd been so quick to agree when Harrison said he was canceling the project. She looked directly at Derek. You knew the math was wrong, didn't you? Derek's face went pale. That's a ridiculous accusation. You knew, Sarah continued, her confidence growing even as her hands shook. And you let him make the error. You wanted him to cancel this project. Victor Harrison slowly set down his pen. He didn't look at Derek. He kept his eyes locked on Sarah. Explain. Sarah's mind was racing, but it was all coming together. When I corrected you, he didn't look confused. He looked angry, defensive. If he'd really checked these numbers 3 times like he claims, he would have caught this basic error. It's architecture 101. But he didn't catch it because he didn't want to catch it. He wanted you to see these numbers and walk away. The color had completely drained from Derek's face now. Why would my development manager want me to abandon a project? Harrison asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Sarah thought about all the years she'd spent watching people in this diner. Learning to read faces, body language, lies. Your competitor, she said softly. Someone else wants this downtown space. If you walk away, they can swoop in and get it cheap. Harrison's jaw tightened. He turned to Derek. I'm listening, and I want to hear from you. Now. Derek was sweating. Sir, this is absurd. You're taking the word of a last chance, Harrison interrupted. The truth. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Derek's shallow breathing. Kendrick Real Estate, Derek finally whispered. They offered me $3 million to make sure you passed on this project. They knew you'd been eyeing this downtown block. If you walked away, they could buy it for half what it's worth. Sarah watched as betrayal flickered across Victor Harrison's face. Just for a moment, The powerful billionaire looked like a man who'd been punched in the gut. Then the steel returned. Get out of my sight. Security will escort you from the building. Your accounts are frozen. My lawyers will contact you about fraud charges. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, then practically ran from the diner. Sarah stood there, suddenly realizing what she'd just done. She'd just destroyed a man's career. Her hands started shaking so badly, she had to clasp them together. Victor Harrison slowly turned his attention back to her. He studied her for a long moment, her stained uniform, her worn-out shoes, her tired eyes that had seen too much for 27 years old. What's your name? Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell, he repeated as if tasting the words. You just saved me from making a $50 million mistake. And you just exposed a traitor in my company. He paused. Why? The question surprised her. Because the math was wrong. I couldn't just stand there and watch someone make a terrible decision based on bad information. You could have, he pointed out. Most people would have. It wasn't your problem. You risked your job, which I'm guessing you desperately need, to correct a stranger. Sarah felt tears threatening. The adrenaline was wearing off, and exhaustion was crashing over her. I used to be someone who solved problems, she said quietly. Before life got in the way. I guess I forgot how to stay quiet. Harrison stood up. He was tall, imposing. He pulled out his wallet and placed $500 bills on the table. That's for the coffee. He looked at her boss, who'd been watching from behind the counter with his mouth open. Joey, your waitress just quit. Wait, what? Sarah gasped. Get your things, Harrison said to her. You're coming with me. Sir, I can't just. Yes, you can. I'm offering you a job. We'll discuss the details in my office. But I'm not leaving here without you. Sarah looked at the bills on the table. At her boss. At the life she'd been living. Okay, she whispered. The ride to Harrison Tower was the most surreal experience of Sarah's life. 1 minute she was pouring coffee in a diner that smelled like grease and broken dreams. The next, she was sitting in a luxury car so expensive she was afraid to touch anything, watching the Chicago skyline grow closer. Victor Harrison spent the entire ride on his phone, barking orders, canceling meetings, making calls that clearly terrified whoever was on the other end. Sarah sat in silence, her heart hammering, wondering if this was real or if she'd finally snapped from exhaustion and was hallucinating. They pulled into a private garage beneath Harrison Tower. Sarah had walked past this building 1,000 times, always with her head down, always invisible. Now she was being led through its gleaming corridors like she belonged there. The elevator required Harrison's fingerprint to access the top floor. As they rose, Sarah's ears popped. The numbers climbed 40, 50, 60, 65. Penthouse. The doors opened onto an office that took Sarah's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Chicago that made her feel like she was flying. The furniture was minimal, but clearly cost more than she'd earned in her entire life. And the space, the beautiful, soaring space, made her architect's heart ache with longing. Sit, Harrison commanded, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk. Sarah sat, clutching her cheap purse, very aware of how out of place she looked. Harrison settled into his chair and studied her. You said you used to be someone who solved problems. What happened? So Sarah told him. About architecture school. About her sister's cancer. About dropping out to keep Amy alive. About the mountain of debt that grew no matter how many shifts she worked. About dreams she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. Harrison listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once. Here's what's going to happen. I'm creating a new position in my company. Special project analyst. You'll work directly under me. Your job is simple. Look at what my team produces and tell me when something's wrong. Find the errors. Find the lies. Find the problems before they cost me millions. Sarah's mouth went dry. Sir, I'm not qualified. You have more natural talent than half my Harvard MBAs. He cut her off. Derek had a degree from Cornell and 15 years of experience. You saw in 30 seconds what he deliberately hid. That's not qualification. That's gift. He named a salary that made Sarah's vision blur. $200,000 a year. Plus a signing bonus. Enough to cover Amy's treatment for the next 2 years. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Sarah thought of Amy, pale and sick. She thought of the red envelopes. She thought of the part of herself she'd killed to survive. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Mr. Harrison. Call me Victor. The next week was chaos. Sarah was processed by HR, given an office, an actual office with her name on the door, and handed a corporate credit card with instructions to buy clothes that don't smell like hash browns. The check that arrived at her apartment made Sarah cry so hard Amy got scared. For the first time in 3 years, she paid every bill in full. She scheduled Amy's next treatment without having to beg for a payment plan. She bought groceries without checking prices. But the real work was just beginning. Victor Harrison's company was massive. Dozens of development projects worth billions of dollars. And he was convinced someone inside was leaking information to Kendrick Real Estate, his main competitor. Derek was small fish, Victor told her in a private meeting. He was being fed information by someone higher up. Someone who's been sabotaging me for months. I need you to find out who. Sarah was terrified. She wasn't a detective. She was a waitress with a talent for math. But then she remembered. Waitresses are invisible. They watch. They listen. They see things people don't think anyone notices. So that's what Sarah did. She watched. She noticed that Margaret Lane, Victor's executive assistant of 18 years, seemed overly interested in what Sarah was working on. Margaret was sweet, motherly, always offering Sarah coffee and advice about navigating office politics. Sarah noticed that certain files were accessed at odd times, late at night, on weekends. Always by Margaret, supposedly on Victor's behalf. She noticed that before every major meeting Victor held at restaurants or off-site locations, Margaret would arrange for catering from the same company, Kendrick Catering Services. The name made Sarah's blood run cold. Kendrick. She dug deeper, using the database access Victor had given her. She traced phone records, email patterns, file downloads. And slowly, horribly, a picture emerged. Margaret Lane wasn't just Victor's assistant. She was related to Richard Kendrick, his main competitor. They were cousins. And for 18 years, Margaret had sat outside Victor's office, smiling and helpful, while bleeding his company dry from the inside. The catering service was the dead drop. Every time Margaret called to order food for Victor's meetings, she was actually confirming the time and location to Kendrick's people. They'd send someone to watch, to listen, to gather intelligence. Sarah's hands shook as she compiled the evidence. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was deeply personal betrayal. She brought everything to Victor late one night when the office was empty. He read through her findings in silence, his face growing harder with each page. 18 years, he finally said, his voice hollow. She was at my wedding. She knew my children when they were babies. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered. Victor looked at her, and for just a moment, she saw the human beneath the billionaire exterior. Hurt, betrayed, tired. Then he stood up, and the steel returned. Don't be sorry. You did your job brilliantly. Now we're going to set a trap. Have you ever watched someone you care about prepare to face their worst betrayal? It's like watching someone put on armor before battle, except the enemy is someone they trusted with their life. That's what Sarah witnessed as Victor Harrison prepared to confront Margaret Lane. But he wasn't just going to fire her. He was going to destroy the entire operation she'd built and take down Richard Kendrick in the process. We need bait, Victor said, pacing his office at midnight. The Chicago skyline glittered behind him like a field of stars. Something big enough that Kendrick can't resist acting on it immediately. Sarah's mind raced. She thought about all the projects currently in development. Then it hit her. The Riverside project. Victor stopped pacing. Go on. It's your biggest venture. That mixed-use development on the waterfront, residential towers, commercial spaces, the whole thing. Kendrick's been trying to get that location for years. Sarah's confidence grew as she spoke. What if you tell Margaret you're canceling it? Make it seem like the financing fell through, like you're going to sell the land rights cheap, just to cut your losses. Victor's eyes gleamed. And when Kendrick gets that information, he'll try to buy those land rights immediately, Sarah finished. He'll move fast, commit millions, maybe even announce it publicly to humiliate you. Except the financing hasn't fallen through at all. Exactly. In fact, you just secured a massive investment from overseas partners. The project is more solid than ever. When you announce that while Kendrick is overextended, he'll be caught with his pants down, Victor finished. A cold smile crossed his face. I like it. It's ruthless. I learned from waiting tables, Sarah said quietly. Sometimes you have to let the customer think they're getting away with something before you present the bill. The next morning, Victor called Margaret into his office. Sarah watched from her desk through the glass walls, her stomach in knots. Victor was a brilliant actor. He looked stressed, defeated. Margaret, I need you to prepare documents. We're shutting down the Riverside project. Even from a distance, Sarah could see Margaret's eyes light up, though she quickly covered it with concern. Oh no, Victor. I'm so sorry. What happened? The financing fell through. The international investors pulled out. I'm cutting my losses, selling the land rights for whatever I can get. I need this kept absolutely quiet until I can announce it properly. The board meeting is at 4 p.m. today. Margaret nodded, all sympathy and support. Of course. I'll handle everything discreetly. The moment she left Victor's office, Sarah tracked her movements through the building's security cameras, a system Victor had given her access to. Margaret went straight to the empty conference room. She pulled out a phone, not her work phone, a second device, and made a call. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Margaret's animated gestures, her excited expression. The call lasted 4 minutes. 30 minutes later, Sarah's financial tracking software, set up to monitor Kendrick Real Estate's activities, lit up like a Christmas tree. Kendrick was moving massive amounts of money, calling in favors, preparing for something big. He's taking the bait, Sarah reported to Victor. Good. Let him. The next few hours felt like waiting for an explosion. Sarah couldn't eat, couldn't focus. She just watched the clock tick toward 4 p.m. At 3:45, Margaret knocked on Victor's door. Everything's ready for your announcement, Victor. The board is assembling. I've prepared your notes. Thank you, Margaret. Actually, I'd like you to sit in on this meeting. You've been with me so long, you should hear this directly from me. Something flickered in Margaret's expression. Was it guilt? Triumph? Then she smiled. Of course. I'd be honored. The boardroom filled with executives, all looking nervous. They'd heard rumors. Sarah slipped in last, taking a seat in the back corner. Victor stood at the head of the table, looking every inch the defeated businessman. Margaret sat nearby, hands folded, the picture of loyal support. Thank you all for coming on short notice, Victor began. I have important news about the Riverside project. Everyone leaned forward. As of this morning, we have secured a $2 billion investment from the Singapore Development Fund. The Riverside project isn't just moving forward. We're doubling its scope. We're adding a third residential tower and an entire retail complex. It's the largest development in Chicago history. The room erupted in applause and shocked exclamations. Everyone except Margaret. Sarah watched the color drain from her face. Watched realization hit her like a physical blow. Margaret, Victor said quietly, and the room fell silent. Do you have anything to add? Margaret's mouth opened and closed. I don't understand. You said the financing fell through. You said you were selling. I said a lot of things, Victor replied, his voice cold as Arctic ice. To see what you would do with that information. He pressed a button. The screen behind him lit up with phone records, financial transfers, emails, security camera footage of Margaret's call that morning. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor continued, for the past 18 years, my trusted assistant has been feeding confidential information to Kendrick Real Estate. Today, based on false information I fed her, Richard Kendrick committed $1.3 billion to purchasing land rights he believed I was selling cheap. Land rights I never intended to sell. He's now catastrophically overextended, and his company will likely face bankruptcy within the week. Margaret stood up, her chair scraping loudly. You don't understand, Victor. You ruined my family. The room gasped. 20 years ago, your company bought out my father's construction business. You called it consolidation. It destroyed him. He died ashamed, broken. Richard is my cousin. We're all that's left of the Lane family. Everything I did was to help him rebuild what you took from us. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was revenge, 20 years in the making. Victor's face was unreadable. Your father's company was bankrupt long before I acquired it. I saved 300 jobs that would have been lost. But you've believed a lie for 2 decades, and you've built your hatred on that lie. He nodded to security. Escort Ms. Lane from the building. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen so gradually you don't notice them until you look back and can't recognize the person you used to be. 6 months after Margaret's arrest, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in her new apartment, a beautiful place with actual sunlight and space to breathe, and barely recognized herself. The exhausted waitress who could barely afford ramen was gone. In her place stood a woman in a tailored suit, her hair styled, her eyes bright with purpose and confidence. But the biggest change wasn't on the outside. Sarah had become Victor Harrison's chief strategic officer. She oversaw entire departments. She had her own team. When she walked into Harrison Tower now, people didn't just move out of her way. They sought her out, asking for her insight, her approval, her guidance. The girl who'd been invisible was now impossible to ignore. But she never forgot where she came from. On her desk, in an expensive frame, she kept a simple napkin from Riley's diner. On it was written the formula that had changed her life. The wrong formula that Victor had written that Wednesday morning. She kept it as a reminder. Speak up, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared. Her office door opened, and Victor walked in without knocking. He never knocked. They'd moved past that formality months ago. Sarah, I need your eyes on something. He dropped a folder on her desk. I'm looking at acquiring a tech company. The owner swears their revenue projections are solid, but something feels off. Sarah flipped open the folder and immediately started scanning the numbers. Within 2 minutes, she'd found it. He's counting pre-orders as confirmed revenue. Look here. This $30 million in projected earnings is actually just deposit money that could be refunded. If even a quarter of these orders fall through, his entire valuation collapses. Victor smiled, not his cold business smile, but a real one. That's my girl. Always finding the lie beneath the numbers. He settled into the chair across from her desk, something he did now when he wanted to talk about more than just business. How's Amy doing? She's cancer-free, Sarah said, her voice catching with emotion even though it had been 3 months since they got the news. The doctors can't believe it. The treatment worked. She's going to be okay. Good. That's really good. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Victor said, I've been thinking about that day in the diner. Me too. All the time. I was so focused on the numbers, on the deal, on being right, I almost made a catastrophic mistake. Not just with the formula, but with Derek, with Margaret. I'd stopped seeing people clearly. I'd surrounded myself with yes-men and traitors and couldn't tell the difference anymore. Sarah leaned back in her chair. And I was so focused on surviving, on just getting through each day, that I'd forgotten I had a voice worth hearing. I'd made myself invisible. We saved each other that day, Victor said quietly. Yeah, Sarah agreed. I think we did. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and smiled. Amy just sent me a photo from her first day back at college. She's studying business. Says she wants to learn to see through liars like her big sister does. Victor laughed. God help the corporate world. After he left, Sarah stood at her window, looking out over Chicago. Somewhere down there was Riley's diner. She could probably see it if she knew exactly where to look. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, desperate, drowning, invisible. She thought about the moment she'd chosen to speak up, even though everything in her screamed to stay quiet and safe. That single moment of courage had shattered her entire world. But from those broken pieces, she'd built something stronger. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered professionally. Sarah Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell, this is Dean Roberts from Chicago University School of Architecture. We've been following your career transformation, and we'd love to discuss you completing your degree with us. Full scholarship, of course. We think your real-world experience combined with your obvious mathematical talents would make you an exceptional architect. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Her old dream, the one she'd buried and mourned, was being handed back to her. Yes. Yes, I'd love to discuss that. After she hung up, she did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled out a sketchbook, one she'd kept hidden in a drawer, filled with building designs she'd drawn during her college days, and she started drawing again. Her hands moved across the page, creating something new. Not the old dreams, but better ones. Bigger ones. Dreams informed by struggle and survival, and the knowledge that she was strong enough to build anything she could imagine. That evening, Sarah did something else she'd started doing every week. She drove back to her old neighborhood and walked into Riley's diner. Joey, her old boss, looked up and grinned. There she is, the famous Sarah Mitchell. Just Sarah, she said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. She ordered coffee, black, just like Victor, and sat there for an hour, talking to the waitresses still working there. She listened to their problems, their dreams, their struggles. And when she left enormous tips and business cards with a note. If you ever need help, call me. Because Sarah understood something now that she hadn't before. Success isn't just about climbing up and leaving everyone else behind. It's about reaching down and pulling others up with you. As she drove home that night, past the glittering towers and the shadowy streets, past the world of the powerful and the world of the invisible, Sarah realized something profound. She existed in both worlds now. And that made her dangerous in the best possible way. The waitress who'd been overlooked had become the woman nobody could ignore. But she'd never forgotten what it felt like to be invisible. And that memory, that understanding, made her unstoppable. Because the people who survive the bottom know something the people born at the top will never understand. When you've already lost everything, you have nothing left to fear. And fear is the only thing that keeps people silent. The end. Sometimes the person pouring your coffee is the smartest person in the room. Sometimes the one you overlook is the one who sees everything. And sometimes all it takes is one moment of courage, one decision to speak up instead of staying silent, to change your entire life. What would you have done in Sarah's place? Would you have risked everything to speak the truth? Let us know in the comments below.